Hollywood love stories often look completely different from the inside. On camera, everything can appear effortless. Beautiful photographs, glamorous premieres, affectionate interviews, and two famous people smiling, as if they have somehow discovered a secret the rest of the world never understood. But behind those photographs can be years of private decisions, grief, insecurity, and moments that never make it into the headlines. For Demi Moore, her marriage to Ashton Kutcher became one of those stories. When Demi Moore met Ashton Kutcher in 2003, the age difference immediately became part of the public conversation. Moore was 40, Kutcher was 25. To the outside world, it looked unconventional, but Moore later described the beginning of the relationship as exciting and emotionally powerful. In her 2019 memoir, Inside Out, she wrote about feeling accepted by a man who seemed comfortable with her complicated life, including her 3 daughters and her history with former husband Bruce Willis. Their relationship moved quickly. They married in 2005, and for several years they appeared to be one of Hollywood's most unexpected couples. Their public image was built around youth, confidence, and the idea that a 15-year age difference did not matter when two people genuinely loved each other. But the private story was far more complicated. One of the deepest wounds came before the marriage itself. Moore and Kutcher experienced a late-term pregnancy loss. Moore later wrote about the devastation in Inside Out, describing how deeply the loss affected her and how much guilt she carried afterward. The experience was not simply another sad chapter in her life. It became part of a much larger emotional struggle that followed her for years. For Moore, the loss was especially painful because she had already spent much of her life trying to escape feelings of insecurity and abandonment. Her childhood had been unstable, and her memoir describes addiction, family trauma, and the constant feeling that she needed to prove she was worthy of love. That history mattered, because sometimes the most damaging relationships do not begin with obvious cruelty. They begin with something that feels like rescue. And that was how Moore described the early part of her relationship with Kutcher. She was a successful actress who had already experienced marriage, motherhood, divorce, and enormous public pressure. Yet internally, she could still feel like the insecure young woman who desperately wanted to be accepted. Kutcher seemed to make those fears disappear. For a while. But after the miscarriage, the relationship entered a more complicated period. Moore later described herself as becoming increasingly disconnected from the person she had been before the relationship. She had been sober for many years, but she acknowledged that she eventually returned to drinking and began using Vicodin during this period. ABC News reported that Moore connected the breakdown of her relationship and the subsequent collapse of her life to much deeper feelings about whether she was lovable and worthy. That distinction is important. The story is not simply that Ashton Kutcher ruined Demi Moore's life. Moore herself has never presented the situation quite that simply. Her memoir is much more complicated. She discusses her own decisions, her addictions, her childhood trauma, her insecurities, and the ways she participated in choices that ultimately made her unhappy. And that may be the darkest part of the story. She did not simply lose a marriage. She felt that she had lost herself. One of the most controversial revelations in Inside Out concerned the couple's sexual relationship. Moore wrote that Kutcher suggested bringing other people into their relationship, and she agreed to threesomes. According to Moore's account, she hoped that being open to those experiences would strengthen their connection rather than weaken it. Instead, she later described feeling that the decisions had contributed to her sense of losing herself. This is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple celebrity scandal. Two adults can make a decision together and still experience that decision very differently. Moore's account was about her emotional response, about what she believed she needed to do to keep a relationship alive and what happened to her sense of identity afterward. She later reflected that she had compromised parts of herself because she wanted the marriage to work, and that feeling became central to her story. She had spent years believing that being loved meant being enough. Enough to keep someone interested. Enough to remain desirable. Enough to compete with youth. Enough to prevent abandonment. Enough to make a relationship survive. But eventually, she discovered that no amount of self-sacrifice can guarantee that another person will stay. Then came the betrayal that pushed the marriage toward its end. In 2011, Moore learned that Kutcher had been unfaithful. She described receiving a notification while she was preparing to promote a project she had directed. According to her account to Diane Sawyer, She contacted Kutcher and asked whether the report was true. He admitted it. Moore then had to continue with her professional obligations while dealing privately with the emotional shock. That detail says something powerful about celebrity life. The cameras do not stop because your personal life has collapsed. A red carpet does not care that your heart is breaking. A scheduled appearance does not disappear because you have just learned something devastating. And Moore described having an almost automatic ability to separate herself from what she was feeling so that she could continue performing in public. ABC News reported that she described this as a kind of emotional protective armor. To millions of people watching, she was still Demi Moore, still glamorous, still composed, still famous. But privately, she was falling apart. The marriage eventually ended, with the couple separating in 2011 and finalizing their divorce in 2013. Their relationship had lasted years, but its end was not the end of Moore's struggle. In many ways, it was only the beginning of the hardest chapter. The public often assumes that divorce brings immediate freedom. For Moore, it brought something else first. Collapse. Her substance use intensified, her health deteriorated, and her relationship with her daughters became severely strained. ABC News reported that Moore described reaching a point where she barely recognized herself and eventually asked the fundamental question, how had she gotten there? That question may be more revealing than any rumor about Ashton Kutcher. How did she get there? How did an actress who had once been one of the most powerful women in Hollywood end up so isolated? How did a woman who seemed to have everything become someone who felt she had lost everything? Moore eventually understood that the answer could not be found in one person. It was not only Ashton. It was not only the marriage. It was not only the miscarriage. It was not only addiction. It was years of unresolved pain coming together. Her childhood had taught her to fear instability. Hollywood had taught her that appearance and desirability could determine how people treated her. Fame had made her constantly visible while leaving parts of her private life painfully exposed. And her relationship with Kutcher became entangled with all of those insecurities. That is why her memoir was so significant. Inside Out was not marketed simply as a tell-all about an ex-husband. HarperCollins described it as a candid memoir about Moore's career, relationships, addiction, childhood trauma, body image struggles, motherhood, and personal resilience. In other words, Ashton Kutcher was one chapter. Not the entire book. Not the entire woman. Not the entire explanation for what happened. But it was a chapter that forced Moore to confront something she had been avoiding. She had been trying to become what she thought other people needed. And somewhere along the way, she stopped asking what she needed. That realization is arguably the darkest secret behind the sensational headline. Because Moore's biggest revelation was not necessarily that Ashton Kutcher cheated. The public already knew that from her memoir and interviews. The deeper revelation was how much she had been willing to sacrifice in an attempt to preserve the relationship. She had entered the marriage believing she had finally found a person who could accept every complicated part of her life. Then, as the relationship deteriorated, she began questioning whether she was still enough. That fear is something millions of people can understand, even if they have never experienced Hollywood fame. What happens when you start measuring your worth by whether another person chooses you? What happens when keeping someone becomes more important than keeping yourself? And what happens when the relationship finally ends? For Moore, the answer was devastating. She had to rebuild herself from the inside out. The title of her memoir became almost symbolic. Inside Out was about turning inward and confronting what had been buried underneath the public image. The actress who had spent decades being photographed, judged, admired, criticized, and analyzed finally began examining herself without the Hollywood filter. She talked openly about addiction. She talked about her childhood. She talked about motherhood. She talked about relationships. And she talked about the painful belief that she was not enough. In her 2019 interview with Diane Sawyer, Moore explained that the collapse surrounding her divorce had connected with much older feelings. ABC News reported that she said the pain was not simply about the relationship ending. It touched the deeper fear that she was not lovable or deserving. That admission changed the meaning of the entire story. Suddenly, the Ashton Kutcher chapter was no longer simply a story about an older actress marrying a younger actor. It became a story about identity, about addiction, about grief, about boundaries, about self-worth, and about what happens when someone spends too long trying to earn love. Years passed. Moore continued rebuilding her life. Her relationship with her daughters gradually improved, and she returned to acting with renewed confidence. She also continued speaking about aging, beauty, and the pressure placed on women in Hollywood. Then came a moment that would have been almost impossible to imagine during the darkest years of her life. In 2025, at age 62, Moore won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Musical or Comedy for The Substance. The award was especially meaningful because it came after more than 4 decades in the entertainment industry. Her acceptance speech was not really about Ashton Kutcher. It was about self-worth. She spoke about reaching a low point and believing that perhaps her career was already over. Then The Substance arrived and reminded her that she was not finished. That moment matters because of everything that had happened before it. The young Demi Moore who once wondered whether she was enough had become an older woman standing on one of Hollywood's biggest stages, receiving recognition she had spent decades believing might never come. At 62, she was not hiding from age. She was not apologizing for it. She was embracing it. And that gave her old relationship story a completely different ending. Because the woman who once feared losing another person's love had finally learned that she could survive losing it. There is also an important point that sensational headlines often leave out. Ashton Kutcher has publicly spoken about the aftermath of the marriage too. In later years, Kutcher expressed affection and respect for Moore's daughters and acknowledged that the divorce had been painful. He also described the experience of divorce as making him feel like a failure. That does not erase Moore's account. It does not change what she experienced. But it reminds us that real relationships are rarely as simple as hero and villain. 2 people can remember the same years differently. 2 people can hurt each other without every painful event fitting neatly into a headline. And 2 people can eventually move forward without pretending that the past never happened. That is why Moore's later evolution is so interesting. She did not need to spend the rest of her life fighting Ashton Kutcher. She did not need to remain trapped inside the identity of his ex-wife. She needed to become Demi Moore again. And that process took years. The most powerful part of the story is not the affair. It is not the age difference. It is not the threesomes. It is not even the divorce. It is the realization that Moore had been searching for external proof of her worth when the answer had to come from within. That is what makes her journey so much more important than a Hollywood scandal. Because fame can make insecurity look glamorous. A person can wear designer clothes, appear on magazine covers, walk red carpets, and still feel completely inadequate. A person can be admired by millions and still be terrified that one person will stop loving them. Moore's story shows the difference between being desired and feeling worthy. Those are not the same thing. For years, the public saw Demi Moore as an icon. But inside, she was fighting battles that no photograph could reveal. She eventually stopped trying to outrun those battles. She faced them. She wrote about them. She admitted her mistakes. She accepted responsibility for her own choices. And she stopped allowing her past relationships to define her future. That is why the title, at 62, Demi Moore revealed the darkest secret of Ashton Kutcher, needs to be understood carefully. There was no single secret suddenly exposed in 2025 that completely changed history. The most significant revelations came earlier, especially through her 2019 memoir and her interview with Diane Sawyer. What changed at 62 was the perspective. By 2025, Moore could look back at the woman she had been and understand her with more compassion. She could see the younger woman who had wanted to be loved. She could see the wife who tried to make a complicated marriage work. She could see the mother whose relationships with her daughters suffered during her darkest years. She could see the addict who had lost control. And she could see the survivor who eventually found her way back. That may be the real secret. Not something Ashton Kutcher supposedly hid from the world. Something Demi Moore discovered about herself. She had never needed to become younger. She had never needed to compete with anyone. She had never needed to surrender her boundaries to prove she was lovable. And she never needed another person to complete her. Her life after Ashton Kutcher became proof of that. The woman who once feared that losing a relationship meant losing herself eventually discovered that the opposite could be true. Sometimes losing a relationship forces you to find yourself. Sometimes the end of a chapter is the first page of the life you were supposed to live. And sometimes the darkest period of a person's life eventually becomes the place where they discover their greatest strength. Demi Moore's story is therefore not simply about what happened between 2 celebrities. It is about what happened to a woman who spent years trying to be enough for everyone else. and eventually realized that she was already enough. At 62, standing beneath the lights of the Golden Globes, she had something that fame could never give her in the past: perspective. She was no longer the woman trying desperately to hold on to a relationship. She was no longer defined by her age, her marriages, her body, or the mistakes she had made. She was Demi Moore. And perhaps that is the ending that matters most. Because the darkest chapter of her story did not have the final word. The final word belonged to the woman who survived it. The woman who rebuilt her family. The woman who returned to her career. The woman who faced her past publicly instead of hiding from it. And the woman who, decades after first becoming famous, finally stood on a major award stage and realized that she had not missed her moment. She was still here. She was still capable. She was still worthy. And she was nowhere near finished. That is the part of Demi Moore's story that the sensational headlines often miss. The real revelation was never simply what Ashton Kutcher did. It was what Demi Moore learned after everything was over. She learned that love cannot be maintained by abandoning yourself. She learned that forgiveness does not require forgetting. She learned that taking responsibility for your own mistakes does not mean accepting responsibility for someone else's choices. And most importantly, she learned that losing someone does not mean losing yourself. Sometimes it means finally finding yourself again. So when people ask what the darkest secret of Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher's marriage was, perhaps the answer is more complicated than any scandalous headline. It was the silent battle happening inside Demi herself. The fear that she wasn't enough. The desperate desire to be chosen. The willingness to compromise her own boundaries. The pain of betrayal. The collapse that followed. And finally, the realization that her value had never depended on Ashton Kutcher in the first place. That is the story Demi Moore has spent years telling, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of survival. And at 62, she had something she could not have possessed when the marriage began in 2005. She had perspective. She had distance. She had survived the version of herself who believed she needed someone else to make her whole. And after everything she had lost, she finally understood what she had gained. Herself. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending Hollywood could have given her. Not another romance. Not another scandal. Not another headline. Just a woman standing comfortably in her own life, finally understanding that she was never required to be anything other than who she was. And that may be the greatest secret of all. Sources used for factual grounding. Demi Moore's memoir Inside Out. ABC News' Diane Sawyer interview. Official Golden Globes coverage and contemporary reporting on Moore's 2025 career resurgence. Hollywood has always been fascinated by relationships that seem impossible from the outside. When two famous people fall in love, the public immediately begins watching. Every photograph becomes evidence. Every interview becomes a clue. Every smile is analyzed for meaning. And when the relationship eventually falls apart, people look backward and try to decide when everything started going wrong. Few Hollywood relationships generated that kind of fascination quite like the marriage between Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher. When they first became a couple in 2003, the reaction was immediate. Demi Moore was already a major Hollywood star, known for films that had made her one of the most recognizable actresses of her generation. Ashton Kutcher, meanwhile, was a much younger actor who had become famous through television and was rapidly establishing himself as a Hollywood leading man. The age difference was 15 years. That number became part of their public identity almost immediately. Some people believed the relationship was a publicity stunt. Others thought it was a strange Hollywood romance that would never last. But Moore and Kutcher seemed determined to prove everyone wrong. They appeared genuinely happy. They attended events together. They spoke warmly about each other. Kutcher became part of Moore's family life, including her 3 daughters from her previous marriage to Bruce Willis. The relationship moved forward at a speed that surprised many observers. And in September 2005, they married. For a while, the couple appeared to have defeated the predictions of everyone who had doubted them. But what the public saw was only one side of the story. Behind the photographs and interviews was a relationship that would eventually become connected to grief, insecurity, addiction, betrayal, and a painful struggle over identity. The most important part of the story is not simply what Ashton Kutcher did. It is what Demi Moore later realized about herself. To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Demi Moore had already lived through a difficult childhood and a complicated personal history before meeting Kutcher. Her memoir, Inside Out, would later reveal that many of the emotional struggles she experienced as an adult were connected to wounds that had begun much earlier in life. Moore had become famous while still relatively young. She experienced enormous success, but fame did not erase insecurity. In fact, fame sometimes made those insecurities more complicated. Every aspect of her appearance could be discussed publicly. Her age was constantly compared with the ages of younger actresses. Her marriages were examined. Her body was analyzed. Her career was judged. Then she met Ashton Kutcher. He was young, energetic, successful, and openly affectionate toward her. For Moore, the relationship offered something she desperately wanted: the feeling that she could be loved without having to hide the complicated parts of her life. Kutcher did not seem bothered by the age difference. That was important. Instead of treating Moore as an older woman who had already experienced most of life's major chapters, he treated her as a romantic partner. He entered her world, met her daughters, and became part of the family. The relationship seemed to say something powerful.